Hello, everyone. My name is Elena Gauthier-Mamerel, and today I will be presenting to you Spinoza, Relational Autonomy, and Shared Decision-Making, or SAM. Today's presentation aims to share some ways in which Spinoza's theory of autonomy can contribute to ongoing debates about the implementation of shared decision-making. Specifically, I will argue that Spinoza's version of relational autonomy proposes to work within existing power asymmetries by focusing on personalized effective management instead of abstract rational equality. In the end, this will lead me to argue for a broad systemic view of shared decision-making beyond the sphere of the patient-doctor dyad. Given the expertise of my audience today, I have decided that it would be more useful if I led up to discussing Spinoza. As a result, I will be spending much more time on point 3, but would be happy to expand on points 1 and 2 in the question period. Here I have a quote from NHS Scotland's report to the Scottish Government in 2018. Quote, "Although many examples of excellent practice exist across NHS Scotland, effective shared decision-making between clinicians and patients is not yet universally embedded. The current challenge is to devise effective ways for supporting cultural transformation, engaging the public, and embedding best practice within mainstream clinical processes." End quote. This quote summarizes the frustration expressed in medical journals, sociology of medicine literature, and patient accounts. It also reflected my own decades-long experience as a disabled patient. Most people agree that shared decision-making is a good idea, but it is still unclear how one is supposed to practice it. As a philosopher, I saw an opportunity to examine the definition of shared decision-making and its underlying theoretical assumptions, in order to propose ways of bridging this theory-practice gap. My research eventually led me to focus on autonomy, and I concluded that even though shared decision-making is a more deliberative model of patient-doctor interaction, it will be difficult to apply as long as it rests on the notion of autonomy linked to the use of independent or pure reason. Reflecting on what kind of autonomy is at the heart of shared decision-making policies also leads us to define what the desired outcome of shared decision-making is. This may seem like a straightforward question, but it is not in practice. Is shared decision-making supposed to empower patients to exercise their autonomy? Is it an ethical means of getting the patient to agree to medical advice? In other words, how should we assess the success of a given shared decision-making process? Finally, these questions lead me to consider what should be the role of medical practitioners within shared decision-making, as this is what a lot of bioethical literature focuses on. And at the heart of this is the question of what does it mean to be a healthcare service provider? What does it mean to engage with the patient in this way as it relates to autonomy? So I want to discuss what I mean by relational autonomy here. Briefly, relational autonomy is a feminist theory of autonomy that posits that there is no such thing as an independent subject, and that autonomy, like all human capacities, is developed in relation with one's environment. Developed by philosophers like Catriona Mackenzie and Natalie Stoljar, relational autonomy has been securing some uptake in bioethics, thanks in part to the efforts of Susan Sherwin. Relational autonomy has importantly framed autonomy as a capacity that can be developed or oppressed by social norms and institutions, and Mackenzie in particular has raised the need to expand our understanding of rationality in regards to autonomy to include emotional or affective factors. It is this latter call to further research that I seek to answer by introducing Spinoza's philosophy to the conversation about moving away from respect for autonomy towards empowerment. So, point number 3, introducing Spinoza. I want to focus on reason for Spinoza because rational capacity is associated with autonomy, both in the common sense use of the word and specifically in healthcare. Reason for Spinoza is a tool, a way of ordering our ideas according to their causes. In this sense, general knowledge of properties must be informed by the particulars of a situation in order to qualify as rational. In other words, what is rational for one person, for example, what empowers them to act according to their nature, is not the same for someone else. This kind of empowerment is not the expression of a fixed or static degree of autonomy. It is developed in relation. Crucially for Spinoza, however, empowering relations must pay attention to what he calls affects, or the body-mind's changes towards more or less power. And here I use the compounded term body-mind because Spinoza maintains that there is no body-mind separation. Some affects like joy and self-esteem increase one's power of acting, and others like sadness and hatred diminish it. This fluctuation can never be entirely controlled by the individual and depends on their environment and web of relations. This leads me to frame Spinoza's theory of autonomy as a practice, as a collective effort that doesn't only depend on the individual, an effort of empowerment that is dynamic, nonlinear, and ongoing. So I'll examine the 3 points I set out one by one. So first, embodied rationality. What do I mean by that? The individualistic model of autonomy that underlies many healthcare policies tends to treat emotions with suspicion because it is wary of manipulation. While Spinoza recognizes the unstable and sometimes harmful role of affects, he does maintain that, as we can never escape embodiment, we must learn to distinguish between supportive and repressive affects. In the clinical setting, this will affect communicative and deliberative practices. Not only are the emotions or affects of the patient relevant to the receiving biomedical information, but the affects of the practitioner come into play as well. Since Spinoza focuses on practical reason, decision-making is about figuring out together what is the good in that particular relationship, and this requires that each party adapts to the other. This means that clinicians engaging in shared decision-making must also pay attention to their own affects and act towards collective empowerment by contributing to a supportive environment. This includes accepting that their biomedical point of view is not necessarily the most important. Another thing embodied rationality in Spinoza highlights is that each relation is embedded in a web of other relations. Therefore, shared decision-making processes are determined by a patient's relationship to healthcare systems in general, as well as to a particular practitioner. This has important implications when it comes to trust. Clinicians should never assume that they, as professionals within a system and wielding institutional power, have or deserve the patient's trust. Part of shared decision-making is establishing that, because otherwise the process will not work. Secondly, looking at relational power, the collective effort to help individual autonomy flourish. As Spinoza's relational approach to autonomy has one major implication, that everyone has a base level of agency. This means that when approaching someone to engage them in a decision-making process, we must attend to the ways that agency has been shaped, consider the form of our own agency at that moment, and try to connect in such a way that increases the autonomy of all involved. In a concrete way, this means paying attention to the changes in degrees of autonomy, which includes affective factors as well as the communication of true information. In the end, the patient-doctor relationship is inscribed in a much larger web of autonomy-encouraging and autonomy-repressing relations. This, in turn, means that practitioners ought to reflect on their own degree of autonomy as it fluctuates and their relation to other stakeholders. If increasing patient autonomy is the goal of shared decision-making, we have to accept that there are multiple ways of evaluating the success of the process, including contributing to patient autonomy beyond the relationship with one practitioner. For example, if repairing lost trust or addressing medical harm is the only thing that shared decision-making process can do, that would count as a success in a Spinoza's sense. Finally, addressing autonomy as practice. Adopting a scalar notion of relational autonomy means committing to the agency that is before us and within us at that given moment. It means recognizing that values and ideas we take for granted, like health or what someone's best interest is, must be re-examined time and time again as we engage in shared decision-making with different people, and even over time with the same person. At the heart of the shared decision-making practice gap, is the reality of asymmetrical power relations. The average person seeking medical care is inherently in a vulnerable position vis-a-vis someone with greater material, political, and epistemic power. Efforts to promote patient autonomy in this context must be attuned to the embodied nature of rationality, and Spinoza's philosophy encourages us to continually place ourselves and our immediate relations within a much broader scope. In this sense, medical practitioners take part in a diversified approach to shape individual autonomy, and therefore, shared decision-making in healthcare should attend to the importance of empowering affects. In conclusion, Spinoza's approach to shared decision-making reframes the decision-making process as one that aims to empower patients, working with their existing agency and helping them develop it. This ultimately points to the need to consider shared decision-making within broader systemic and social practices, centering autonomous empowerment beyond the doctor-patient dyad and paying attention to affectivity. Merci beaucoup. Je peux maintenant répondre à vos questions.